think this conference has been very successful because each year we think of different topics that are important. And I will have to admit that this topic was suggested by Fred. And I would not have thought of it, but it's a really important topic. And he said, you know, all this focus has been on how you invent things, how you get them approved and so forth. But he says, if you look at the data, it shows that the failure rate of commercialization, once people, you know, have gotten approval from the FDA, the number of drugs that don't actually make the market is an astonishingly high. So we're going to focus on it because, as I say, yeah, it's important to get your drug approved. It's important to figure out how to manufacture it, whatever. But you also have to figure out whether you're going to get to the marketplace. I'm very, very pleased to have two really distinguished people here on this panel. Fred Hassan doesn't need an introduction because he's quite famous and ran a number of major pharmaceutical companies and so forth. And Michael Christel is a global managing editor of Pharmaceutical Executive and actually Pharmaceutical Commerce and Applied Clinical Trials. Are you enjoying the 3 salaries that they give you? It's really hard to figure out how to spend all that money. Right?
Well, the other two are just voluntary.
Yeah, but they are clearly the leader in the C-suite with regard to senior management decision and marketing, with particular focus on marketing commercialization as well. And I must admit, I have a wonderful relationship with them. I've been on the editorial advisory board since they invented fire or something like that. And it's a wonderful, wonderful publication organization. So let's start out. And I just want to ask you just how big a problem is it? And maybe Fred, you want to start out?
Sure.
And really, it's a pleasure, Peter, to work with you. I've been with you for 15 years. Also, a pleasure to work with you, Michael. I've been on the front cover of Pharmaceutical Executive 3 times. So, used to be, I've had a chance to see many products flow from the lab through the clinic to the marketplace. There is definitely a problem developing. If you look at the figures, the number of drug launches, which are north of 80% of analyst expectations in year 1, used to be 50%, and now it's dropped down to 35%. So the old numbers were, I happen to do a big thing every year called Research and Development Leadership Summit. And we talk a lot about R&D and the probability of technical and regulatory success, which is about 10% when you go into the human, maybe 60% when you go into phase 3. But this probability of commercial success is the third element now that's definitely there. And the reason I personally think it's happening are 3 reasons. Number 1, the payers, primarily the insurance companies and specifically the PBMs, are under increasing stress to make their margins, to protect their margins, and they're also using differential co-pays a lot more aggressively now than ever before, which means you can drive for more rebates through co-insurance, co-pays by patients. So that's the first big thing that's happening. Second is that the new molecules and approaches are now very new and very dramatically different than the past. So financial analysts have a tough time using precedents to make their financial models, and the beta tends to be very high in this case. And the third aspect, which is really a real thing, is the doctor separation. So the conventional approach used to be 5 detailing trials, detailing hits in person with the doctor, journal ads, medical meetings, samples, direct mail, and you had a good chance you were going to break through. Now it's not just those doctors, but the younger doctors who are digital natives and who are typically no-see or appointment-only doctors. And you need omnichannel and new approaches, including social media. And their patients are now also learning more through social media. So learning how to do this properly is a challenge for the industry. Some people are doing it very well, others are not, and even the regulatory construct is not very clear here. So these are my 3 reasons why we're seeing a problem here.
Peter, I appreciate the support over the years. Great to see you, Fred. Yeah, and what Fred's, echo what Fred's saying as far as, the development to commercial journey. At Pharma Exec, as Peter, as you alluded to, we focus a lot on post-launch challenges and the playing field post-launch, particularly with, we've had to put our news hats on a lot this year with everything that's occurring. So post-launch, I'd love for Fred and Peter, I'd love to get your thoughts too on we're looking hard at the access hurdles that are out there, the pricing dynamics, the legislation going, the most favored nation, right? The IRA negotiation prices, payer parameters that are increasing, right? Things like that, the PBM exclusionary list, all that stuff, just the whole dynamic of access. I'd love to get your thoughts on how companies, people are navigating that. And we try to do a lot of strategic analysis on that. What does it all mean? And that's what we're trying to answer. And so the access landscape, I think, is in a lot of flux. And I'd love to get your thoughts on these new models. We're looking at, DTC pharmacy models that big pharma are trying to do more. Are they viable for companies, or is it just more for like a patient impact and stuff like that? So long story short, we're just we're trying to kind of parse through whether it's policy, whether it's the payer relationship, whether it's the most favored pricing, whether it's the Trump agreements with large pharma. What does that mean? Is that can we even extrapolate that stuff to commercial success going forward? Or is it just the blockbusters? If you have a good blockbuster candidate, just push that, or is it continuing to kind of diversify? Just for the whole mix. So love to hear some thoughts.
You have any thoughts?
Yeah. Sure. That's a few questions and one question.
He only asked about 10 questions,
Yes.
but you can choose which ones to answer.
So the issue of MFN has always been there. It's become now much more visible. I think the companies have to become very realistic about this situation, that there is a reference tendency developing in the US, which was not always the case in the past. And therefore, you cannot have huge differentials in prices in the US, which is a free market, compared to other places which are typically price controlled in various ways, directly or indirectly, including Canada. So that's the reality. And this might mean, in many cases, having to hold off on launching in some countries, which is unfortunate, but it may have to be the case. Or in some cases, licensing out the molecule to some other entity so that you won't have a price comparison. Or in some cases, this may be the only country where the molecule might see the market. And that might even apply to foreign companies working in this country, because if that's the only way they can succeed, that's the way it's going to be. But this is now a reality. As far as the complexity, I think it's always individual to the patient and the molecule. So, for example, Skyrizi, Rinvoq have done very well. They are heavily advertised direct to consumer, the way it used to be 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's working for AbbVie very well. Where the molecule is applicable to vast portions of the population, with maybe an older demographic that watches that kind of television, I think it does work. It still works. But a lot of the new stuff that's coming along is personalized with smaller audiences, and one needs to do a lot of very smart, intelligent segmentation, and then have individualized approaches. Just like we're talking about the decade or the age of personalized medicine, we're now talking about the personalized approach to payers, doctors, and patients. So personalized, that's extremely important.
Yeah, I haven't agreed with a lot of what you said, and, I mean, that's, I'll make one supportive comment, which is the role of advertising has changed the world. And 30 years ago, you know, I mean, right now, if you watch any, in any of the programming, the number of pharmaceutical drug ads is enormous. But it also means the role of advertising depends on what drug you're producing, right? But the other is it's really changed the dynamics of who can afford it and not afford it. You know, it used to be, you know, mainly you worry about getting funding to get FDA approval. Now the dollars involved for commercialization have gone up. One question I have for you is this. One of the things I hear a lot from CEOs that we work with is the extent to which the role of the PBMs has really, they become very, very powerful and a major either enabler or a blocker of your ability to commercialize. And we tell a lot of companies, just, you know, you got to spend a lot of time talking to the payers and the PBM because they can either make or break you. Now, as the role of PBMs has changed, and in fact, right now, there's a big argument about whether they're too powerful, whether they're making too much of the money, right? How has their role changed, and how has it affected the whole commercialization success rate of the strategy?
Yeah, in my conversations with CEOs of late, they've always touched on that sensitive topic, PBMs. You know, some have been actually involved in reform efforts in Washington to try to curb, you know, in their opinion, curb, you know, the PBM, you know, bringing in more of the money per se. Yeah, but I mean, they're looking at different strategies, right? I mean, I don't know, BTC, you know, going the direct to consumer route to try to avoid some of that middle ground is viable in their opinion yet. I mean, they or you know, kind of recalibrating everything for payers. I mean, they always cite kind of the gap in commercial insurance for what type of patients pay. You know, their deductibles, if they're going for higher deductibles these days, therefore there's a huge gap that they pay at the pharmacy. And that kind of PR gets back, you know, engulfs the drug companies a lot. So they're looking for solutions in that area. They're looking for help from legislators in the US, you know, to rein in PBMs. But we're exploring that. What might be a viable solution to that for farmers, but also in the affordability access, you know, space for patients. You know, what do you hear?
Yeah. So first of all, there's sometimes a tendency for the situation to be adversarial between pharma and PBMs. I personally think it's totally unnecessary because if you go back to the older days, it's actually pharma that used to own these PBMs, which have now become very large. And to me, this is an example of failed government policy, not thinking long term, to allow 80% of the volume to be ruled by 3 entities creates its own issues, and that's the issue right now. It's not really the fault of the PBMs, but it was allowed to happen by the government, short-sighted policy making. I think this direct-to-patient movement is profound. And I have to compliment Lilly for really opening it up in a big way. You saw Lilly Direct took the prices down to the patients to a level that was affordable. They actually did some market research and they found that up to 40% of the American households could afford that price for the GLP-1. And since that time, it's come down a little bit more because now Novo's in there. And now you might have heard the announcement from CMS that they are hoping it'll get down to $150 with the approval of an oral GLP-1. And the more the price points come down, the more the usage will increase. So earlier on, there was a market of 45 to 50 million people who were candidates for GLP-1s, but only 5 million were on. Now you're going to see 20, 30 million people getting there because the price points are coming down. I think it's a win-win, but it's true that maybe the PBMs might make less money on GLP-1s, but patients will definitely win. And pharmas are going to do fine because now they'll have a lot more of a dam on the patients.
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting phenomenon. And actually, when you think about what the original business logic was for PBMs, it's instead of gone away from that, you know, like volume negotiation, whatever, and it's really changed. So, but I agree with you, Fred. It's not clear that it's not their fault. They're just doing what they're allowed to do and run a business.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just gone a little too far in terms of their relative power. But I do think the direct-to-patient thing is going to be interesting. And also, you know, drug companies have been very afraid about using price because they think of price as lowering price is bad. But I remember one of the projects I worked on when I was at Bain was for Bausch and Lomb. And they had, and I think you know the story because you were involved with them, but they were the leader in contact lenses. But that was a time when you had to go to a specialist to have the contact lenses fit, and they were very expensive and so forth. But Bausch and Lomb was losing 1% market share every month because of all these startups that were coming up under their pricing level. And I remember when we gave a recommendation, we said, look, it's inevitable that the distribution will shift from just a specialist to more general doctors. If that's going to happen anyway, and you're low cost because they use the lathe method to make the contact lenses, which is much lower than now it's irrelevant because the cost is such a small part, but there's a price volume relationship. So if you go ahead and drop the price, you will get dramatically more volume and you may make more money. But that's where the market's going anyway, but you might drive a lot of these startups out. And that's what they did, but the CEO said, you better be right because otherwise I've lost my job. You know, because if I drop it, I just, you know, lose a lot of profits. But if you go back in history, it turns out they made a lot more money. Now, Bausch and Lomb lost its way again at some point in terms of innovation, but there was a point where you had to persuade somebody who high price was, you know, the holy grail. But I think the drug companies have to think, think differently about it.
Yeah, a quick follow-up.
There's curious that also about in the equation these alternative pharmacy models, BDMs like Mark Cuban's company, they're trying with generics, but they're also moving into GLP-1s. How do you see that fitting in?
I think the generics were a special situation. It was becoming ridiculous to have list prices that were 10 times the actual price. Patients were suffering from the high co-pays on those kinds of artificial list prices. So Mark Cuban did a fantastic job disrupting the market. I think that market will continue because there is a more transparent market. But this DTP is creating all kinds of opportunities for patients. So for example, you can buy GLP-1s directly from Lilly or from Novo, as long as you have a doctor making the intermediary judgment. You might have heard the news on PCSK9, which came in at a very high list price because it was considered a biotech. Then it got dropped down to about $6,000, which was still high, nowhere close to the Lipitor price. But now if you look at the DTP there, it's going to be Lipitor plus 100%, and yet it's a huge innovation because it's demonstrating outcomes in patients who may not have been looked at before. These are people who don't have existing cardiovascular issues, just the general population. So those kinds of advances are good because you want people to be managed better. Cardiovascular is still the #1 reason why we have deaths. So getting more PCSK9s out there, fantastic. $8 a day.
So it only works for certain products, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You comment a little about disruption, right? Disruption. Do either one of you see any changes that will disrupt this issue about the distribution and commercialization? I mean, for example, Amazon has threatened that they're going to disrupt the whole distribution process. They made some moves, but nothing major yet. But Do you see any of that coming, and Mark, you talked about marketing or whatever, any significant disruptions that might change, one, the dynamic of commercialization, but also ultimately, success on the drug side?
I think there'll be many options for patients who are trying to get the lowest possible price. Amazon will be one of them. But the fact that you can buy from some of the big pharmas directly is a huge disruption. Now, all pharmas probably won't be able to do that, but the fact that distribution channels are now opening up and in a way getting commoditized is a huge opportunity for patients and for the providers. And maybe the old payers are not going to do that well, but it's still going to be good for volume overall, in my opinion. I think the US population has been somewhat underserved with very high prices, and the amount of adherence has not been very high. I think the fact that these price points are coming down in a rational way is going to improve the uptake of pharmaceuticals.
I guess there's also like supply chain implications too, or potential drug shortages. But these companies seem to be, sort of avoiding, snags in that area. With all the volume, do they have to really look more closely at drug shortage, strategies?
Well, I think we have been very lax with our supply chain, and we've been systematically outsourcing it overseas. I think the new administration's emphasis on onshoring is very good. I've always maintained that manufacturing should be close to R&D because then you can make both functions better. If you're outsourced 10,000 miles away, you're not going to be able to do the back and forth that you can if it's onshore. So I think that's a great movement. I think there will be some shortages in difficult areas where this country has totally outsourced its know-how as well, like APIs in certain categories are totally gone to Asia. Bringing them back might be very difficult, but there may be other areas in the newer categories where this country can still do fine. I think the biggest challenge in supply chain is going to be the cold chain issue, where you want to make sure that it ends at the doorstep properly, and some cold chain requires minus 20 degrees centigrade, some cold chain requires even minus 80 degrees. That kind of challenge is going to have to be looked at.
Yeah, and that became very publicly, publicized with the COVID, vaccines, and where the supply chain. And by the way, realistically, although there's a desire on the part of many politicians to onshore manufacturing, there are some things for which the U.S. will never be able to launch on. We are not going to make tennis shoes in the United States, no matter what you say. But I think the drug industry, as you said, there are certain products and technologies that are viable and beneficial to be made here in the United States. The last question I have before I ask if there are any questions is, what advice would you give? So pretend you're in the elevator and you've got a CEO of a pharma or biotech company in the elevator, and you're going up to the 5th floor, and he says, what are the key pieces of advice would you give about improving my success at commercialization? What would you say between the 1st floor and the 5th or 6th floor?
So I would just say that understand your job as a CEO. You might have come up through the finance function or through the legal function or some other function, but the driving function in pharmaceuticals is the innovation engine, the innovation corridor that you develop. And the most, like I'll give you an example. In my past, we had what was called an integrated product flow system. We would meet 10 times a year. The head of that committee was the head of R&D, but on that committee was the head of commercial, the CFO, the supply chain person, and myself as CEO, but I was there. The real chairman was the R&D person. And we would meet 10 times a year, 4 hours every time. We would discuss portfolio management, where are we investing? Are we investing in the right place? Project management, and had project managers on the priority projects and the fast track projects talk to us. And then finally, shaping the molecule. You gotta shape it with creativity earlier on, and don't expect a handoff at the end to marketing. If marketing is on the table, you can shape it a lot better. I'll give you one example. We had a drug for urinary incontinence, which we were able to shape into what's called overactive bladder. The category became 5 times as valuable when it was overactive bladder. If you shape it right, you can do very well down the road.
Michael, any comment?
5
floors.
yeah. Well, since we sort of covered the industry, I don't know if they'd actually appreciate me, offering them advice, so. But what I do is I would, try to capture their stories as best as you can, try to kind of, you give them some context, some perspective, and wish them good luck, and hopefully connect again and just, keep an eye on it going forward.
Yeah, Fred, I really like your comment because I actually do believe that your point about making sure that all of the different parts have a seat at the table from the very beginning.
Yeah, right.
And there's so many famous cases where they got so fixated on the development side that they screwed up the CMC side or whatever it is. But commercialization and marketing has to have a seat at the table. And so forth. And although I can't think of an example on the drug side, but I'll give you one example of where if you don't have the right people at the table, you come to the wrong conclusion. There's a guy I know who was head of the project at DuPont when they invented Teflon. And he recalled, and the R&D people had a meeting and they were all excited and they say, we invented something so nothing sticks right to the thing. And they gave the scientific data and they showed all this stuff or whatever and so forth. And one guy from marketing commercialization raised his hand and said, excuse me, if nothing sticks to it, how does it stick to the pan? And there was like 5 minutes of dead silence.
Yeah.
And so the R&D people said, ooh, we have a little work to do.
Sure.
Because if it doesn't stick to anything,
Yeah,
it's a worthless product. But that guy from the marketing department, he says, I'm not a scientist, but wait a minute, if I got to sell this thing, it's got to stick to something, right?
Yeah.
On one side. So, any questions from the audience here?